The graphs below show the numbers of male and female workers in 1975 and 1995 in several employment sectors of the Republic of Freedonia. Write a report for a university teacher describing the information shown. You should write at least 150 words. Male and female workers in 1975 in Freedonia. Male and female workers in 1995 in Freedonia. Sample answer 1. The diagrams compare the male and female employment status in 6 different job sectors in 2 different years, 1975 and 1995. As is seen from the given illustration, men were well ahead of women in all the job sectors in Freedonia in 1975. However, the scenario changed in 1995 and women employment scenario showed a remarkable progress. According to the charts, men in Freedonia were visibly ahead of females in manufacturing, finance/banking, wholesale and retail trade, defense and non-defense sectors. In manufacturing, more than 600 male employees could be seen against only 300 female employees out of 1,000 employees. Except in the communication sector, the proportion of male employees was far greater than that of females. Among the given job sectors, the public/non-defense sector had the highest number of employees while the defense sector had the least ratio of employees. After 20 years, women showed an outstanding advancement in these job sectors and they went well ahead of men in communication, wholesale and retail trade sectors. They become almost equal in number in finance and banking jobs while the gap between male and female employees number reduced in defense jobs. The only sector still dominated by the male was manufacturing and the job ratio in this sector remained almost the same as it was 20 years earlier. Sample answer 2. The line graphs show the information about employment scenario in Freedonia by gender in 6 different employment sectors during 1975 and 1995. It is very clear from the overall trend that men were pretty much dominating the job markets both during 1975 and 1995, but women made progress in the given 20 years period. According to the first graph that depicts the employment status in 1975, there were far more male employees in all the employment sectors than its opposite sex. Nearly half of the employees in the manufacturing industry were men. Most strikingly, 75% of financial sector employees were male. However, women appeared to be competing for shoulder to shoulder against their male counterpart in the communication sectors. Turning to the 1995 data, females had made a significant improvement in securing jobs in different employment sectors. On top of that, women outmatched the male counterpart in securing jobs in communication and wholesale and retail trade industry. Furthermore, nearly half of the communication sector employees were women. In finance sector as well, women were not very far behind. Comparing the two graphs, it seems very clear that in between those 20 years the number of male employees in these sectors had remained considerably the same, but there was a considerable increase of female employees in the majority of these job sectors. Sample answer 3. The line graphs provide data on the workforce in 6 different professions in the Republic of Freedonia in 1975 and 1995. As is observed, the graphs illustrate the progress of empowering women in the work market over the 20 years. Even the number of females exceeded the number of males in some work fields. In 1975, the number of employed men was considerably higher compared to the number of women in all sectors, in particular, manufacturing, finance and banking and public sector, defense. By 1995 there was a significant increase in the number of working females in communication, finance, and marketing and wholesale and retail trade, where the number of employed women in these sectors was around 250, 120 and 550 out of 1,000 respectively, and it rose by approximately 300 out of 1,000 in each sector. Taking into consideration the number of women surpassed the number of men in communication and wholesale and retail sectors, it is evident that women empowerment in employment sectors in Freedonia had significantly progressed in the given period. Sample answer 4. The line graphs illustrate the number of male and female workers in various employment sectors of the Republic of Freedonia in the year 1975 and 1995. The first point to note is that the highest number of male and female workers were occupied in the public sector and wholesale and retail trade sector in both years. Public sector occupied the same number of employees in both 2 years, that is 840 males and 640 females in 1,000 employee. Wholesale and retail trade sector stands close behind with 650 male and 460 female employees in the year 1975, while a slight reverse order in the year 1995 with 800 females and 650 males per thousand. Manufacturing section consumes almost an equal number of employees in both years with 600 males and half of its females. Interestingly, almost an equal number of employees in communication sector in the year 1975 with 24% and 25% females and males respectively, changed to its double in female workers and with the same number of male workers in the year 1995. This same trend was shown in finance and banking sector. However, defense public sector occupied the lowest number with 10 female and 210 male workers out of 1,000 workers in the year 1975 and 100 females and its double male workers in the year 1995. In conclusion, it is clear from the graphs that there are fluctuations in the number in both years, but male employees are more compared to females in almost all the sectors in the given years. Model answer 5. The provided illustrations compare the male and female workers in different employment sectors in Freedonia over 20 years of time by providing data for the years 1975 and 1995. As is observed from the given line graphs, women were far behind in employment in Freedonia in 1975, but within 20 years they made remarkable progress almost in all sectors and went well ahead of men in communications and wholesale and retail trade sectors. The graphs compare the number of male and female workers in 6 different sectors of Freedonia per thousand. In 1975, more men than women were employed in almost all the mentioned sectors of job categories. For instance, approximately 650 men were employed in manufacturing-related jobs compared to only 300 women per thousand of total employees in the same sectors. In almost all other cases, the numbers of male employees were much higher than the women, and in communication sectors men were a bit ahead than female in their employment ration. After 20 years, in 1995, women made outstanding progress in Freedonian job sectors. For instance, in communication sectors, almost 600 female were employed compared to 300 male workers per thousand. Women went ahead of men in wholesale and retail trade sectors too. Except for the public sectors, non-defense, women hold the trends of progress compared to men in all other sectors. In 1975 only about 40 women worked in defense sectors, and this number grew to more than 100 per thousand after 20 years. In summary, women did remarkable progress in Freedonian job fields over 20 years and they went ahead of men in many job sectors. Sample answer 6. The provided line graphs compare the employment history of men and women in 1975 and 1995, dividing in 6 major sectors, namely manufacturing, communications, finance/banking, wholesale and retail trade, non-defense public sectors and defense public sectors. As is observed from the given illustration, significant changes have been made in women's employment, and women appear to have made remarkable improvements in almost the entire job sectors in Freedonia, and in some sectors women went well ahead of men. Initially, in 1975, men were notably ahead of women in every sector of employment. For example, in the communication sector, about 260 men worked against 220 women in every 1,000 employees. 20 years later, though the number of men remained unchanged, the number of women rose to over 550 in 1,000. A similar trend can be seen in the wholesale and retail trade sector, where the number of women rose from about 550 to almost 800 in every 1,000 employees of this sector 2 decades later. The number of men in this sector remained stable over the period, at around 700/1,000. Women also made their prominence in both the finance/banking industries and in the defense-related public sector during this period, where 125 women among 1,000 employees worked in finance and banking institutions in 1975. This number increased to 450 by 1995. The number of men grew only marginally from 425 to 480 over the same period. In the defense sector, the number of men declined from 225 to 200 per thousand, while the number of women rose from 25 to over 100 per thousand. 2 sectors that remained almost stable in terms of men and women employee ration are manufacturing and public sector. In manufacturing, about 300 women and 650 men worked in both surveyed years, and in public sector, non-defense, which employed 650 women and 850 men. In summary, we can say that women appear to have made gains in the workforce in Freedonia, and in some sectors they went well ahead compared to men. Tips for answering this academic writing task 1 question. 1 2-line graphs are provided in this writing task 1, so start the introduction part as follows. The given line graphs provide data on. Do not use the give line graph shows, as there are more than one graphs present in this question. 2 The 2-line graphs compare the number of male and female employees in 6 employment sectors in Freedonia. The first graph shows the data for the year 1975 while the second graph shows data for the year 1995. 3 The first graph shows that the male employees were well ahead in all the job sectors in Freedonia, but after 20 years that scenario changed and women did a remarkable progress in the job sectors. 4 Initially, in 1975, men were higher in number in terms of their involvement in different work sectors. Only in finance and banking sector, females were close to males. 5 After 20 years in 1995, the number of women employees crossed the number of men employees in communications and wholesale and retail trade sectors. 6 In the communication sector, the number of women employees reached to 550 per thousand while this number was only 210 per thousand in 1975. 7 Do not only give the numbers of male and female employees in 6 job sectors of Freedonia in 1975 and 1995. Rather make a comparison of the male and female employee numbers and show some of the comparisons for women about how many of them were employed in 1975 and how these numbers have increased in 1995. Keep in mind that the writing expects you to be able to compare the women's improvement and increasing involvement in job sectors of Freedonia. Summary of the graphs. In Freedonia, women's involvement in major job sectors has increased remarkably in 20 years. Initially, in 1975, they were less in number than the male employees in all the 6 major job sectors. But within 20 years, they did significant progress and have crossed the number of male employees in some sectors. Sample answer 7. The provided line graphs compare the number of male and female workers in 6 broad job sectors of Freedonia. As is presented in the 2-line graphs, women have made a significant improvement in Freedonian job sectors over the 20 years. Initially, in 1975, men were ahead in all job sectors than women. In manufacturing job fields, around 220 women were employed while the number of male employees was well over 600 per thousand. Men were ahead of women in terms of their involvement in jobs in all of the mentioned 6 broad sectors. In finance/banking, wholesale and retail trade, non-defense public sector, women were far more behind than their male counterpart. Only in communications sector women were close to men. Among 1,000 employees in defense public sector women were less than 50 where men were around 250. The first graph thus depicts the men and women workforce in Freedonia in 1975. But after 20 years in 1995, the scenario had changed significantly. Women crossed men in terms of their job involvement in communication and wholesale and retail trade. In defense, the number of women workers doubled that the number of 1975, whereas the number of men had decreased to 200. In non-defense sector, the differences had not changed that much, but in communications and finance/banking sector women have done significant improvement compared to their number 20 years back. In summary, women in Freedonia had done a remarkable progress in job sectors and in some cases had superseded their male counterparts. Sample answer 8. The line graphs illustrate the number of male and female workers in various sectors in Freedonia in 1975 and 1995. It is evident that manufacturing, trade, and non-defense public sector employed most number of people. From the graph, it is clear that in 1975, male workers were involved in much greater numbers than females, especially in manufacturing where about 700 men per thousand were involved, which was more than twice the number of females. Similarly, men were employed over 5 times the number of females in banking. In all the other sectors men were considerably ahead in terms of employment in 1975. Then in 1995 female employment rocketed in communications, becoming almost double of that for males, 300. It surpassed the male employment in retail trade as well. 800 women per 1,000 employees. Except in manufacturing where the situation remained the same as 1975, women employment increased significantly in all the other sectors. Thus it is clear that male employment was much higher in 1975 compared to women, but women employment have rocketed through the 20 years and has surpassed the male employment in some sectors. Model answer 9. The graphs give us a brief idea about the various changes that have taken place in 6 different employment sectors in Freedonia based on the population of both male and female sexes from 1975 to 1995. Though there isn't a major increase in the overall number of employees, some of the individual sectors showed a notable increase in its work population. The defense sector had the least number of men and women, and even though there was a slight variation in the number of women, the number of men in this sector remained the same in both the years. Manufacturing at 600 above men, 250 women, and public sector apart from the defense at 800 above men and 600 above women in 1,000 workers had no significant changes in both the years whatsoever. Most changes had been in the communication, finance, and wholesale sectors, with a large increase in the number of people from 1975 to 1995 speak out in the volume of the interest of the general public towards these sectors. Communication and wholesale sector had seen a huge hike in the number of women, even overtaking men in the process. On these grounds, I conclude by saying the prominence of women in employment sectors in Freedonia is evident when we compare the graph of 1995 and 1975. Model answer 10. The line graphs compare the number of male and female employees in every 1,000 in 6 sectors in Freedonia in 1975 and 1995. At a glance at the graph, it is clear that women advanced well in 20 years in Freedonia in terms of their involvements in different jobs. As can be seen from the graphs, among all the sectors, non-defense public sector was the most popular working field for both the genders in 1975, in which the number of males and females was around 900,000 and 700,000 respectively. Interestingly, the figures for both the genders in this sector remained the same even in 1995, followed by wholesale and retail sector, where the rate of women employees was 570,000 in 1975, which rose to 800,000 after 2 decades, whereas the figures for their counterparts worked in the same sector stayed at a constant figure of 800,000 throughout the period. Likewise, in the field of manufacturing, the number of males and females had no change after 20 years, from 700,000 and 300,000 respectively. Noticeably, the number of men occupied in the field of communication and banking/finance remained steady during the time period at 300,000 and just over 400,000 correspondingly. Whilst the figures for female employees in communication sector underwent a threefold increase from about 300,000 by 1995. Similarly, in the banking sector, women had a fourfold rise to almost 450,000. It can be seen that only 25,000 women worked in the defense/public sector in 1975, while the figures for men was more than 225,000. However, the rate of the former rose by 4 times and reached 100,000 after 20 years, whereas the figures for the latter had a fall to 200,000. Model answer 11. The given bar charts illustrate the employment status of Freedonian women and men in different sectors in 1975 and 2 decades later in 1995. The x-axis presents the number of working people in thousands, while the y-axis presents 6 sectors of employment. The public sector is the greatest employment opportunity provider in both the fiscal years, providing job to almost 850,000 people with little change in the composition of male and female workers, where more than 75% of women constituted its workforce. Jobs in manufacturing and finance/banking sector are fairly steady at around 600,000 and 450,000 respectively during both the years. However, the composition of the workforce in finance/banking sector changed, with almost all the women employees displaced more than half of the men workforce during 1995. Wholesale and retail trade industries workforce grew slightly in 1995, but the composition of workforce reversed during the later year, with men displacing more than 2/3 of women workforce. Communication sector employed twice the number of employees in the later year. However, it had hired a lot of men employees, leveling the male-female ratio of workers in its industry. Defense, however, had contracted its opportunities, but it had increased the number of women workforce by more than half of its workforce, which was quite negligible in 1975. Model answer 12. The line graphs show a comparison between the numbers of male and female employees in 6 different work fields in Freedonia. The comparison covers a span of 20 years from 1975 to 1995. Overall, a male superiority in specific professional fields like manufacturing and non-defense public sectors was obvious, while professional women progressed remarkably during the period. The manufacturing sector in Freedonia had a male workforce that was almost twice than its female counterpart, 650,000 and 300,000, respectively, and those numbers remained the same in 1975 and 1995. Non-defense public sectors had a tight margin of 200,000 employees in favor of male workforce. However, other sectors like communications and wholesale and retail trade witnessed a female domination during the 20-year span. Communications showed static male employees as the number of male employees remained the same, 300,000, while the female employee in the same field remarkably grew, from almost 250,000 employees in 1975 to about 550,000 in 1995. Moreover, females took over wholesale and retail trade positions with a number that jumped dramatically from 550,000 to 800,000 in comparison to its male counterpart. The remaining 2 fields, finance/banking and the defense public sectors, witnessed a male supremacy, yet females' number in finance/banking grew rapidly from around 100,000 in 1975 to almost 450,000 in 1995, decreasing the gap significantly between males and females. Besides, a slight increase in female employees was spotted in defense public sectors in 1995, however, males still had the upper hand in that sector. Model answer 13. The graphs give information about the employees in the Republic of Freedonia by their genders in 6 sectors in 1975 and 1995. The sectors are manufacturing, communication, finance or banking, wholesale and retail trade, public sector for non-defense, and defense. Overall, the male employees were well ahead of the women employees in terms of their number in all sectors in 1975. However, the scenario changed in 1995, and the women led in some sectors. As is presented in the illustration, men were leading in all sectors in 1995. The numbers of men employees were well over double than that of women in 3 sectors such as manufacturing, finance, and defense. In the communication sector, the men were almost 300 and women were about 250. These are not different, but in wholesale and retail trade and non-defense sectors, their results were almost 200 different. However, women's employment showed remarkable progress in some sectors after 20 years. The number of women employees were around 600 while the men were over 300 in communications, and then women were ahead almost 100 than men in wholesale and retail trade. Moreover, female employment increased significantly in all sectors in 1995. Model answer 14. The graphs give information about the employment sector in Freedonia and breakdown the result by gender in 6 different employment sectors in the years 1975 and 1995. At first glance, there were more male workers than females in general in those sectors. However, dramatic improvements have taken place for women's work scenario after 20 years. With regards to the manufacturing and non-defense public sector, the number of both men and women workers remained relatively the same. Whereas in 2 fields, namely communication and wholesale, the number of women workers went above the number of men. In finance, the number of female workers had increased twofold from the year 1975 to 1995, whilst only a small change appears in men's job scenario. Out of the 6 sectors, defense category had the least number of employees. The women in this sector increased from nearly 20,000 in 1975 to 100,000 in 1995. In contrast, there was a slight decrease in the number of men employees in this sector. Model answer 15. The provided line graphs illustrate the employment situation in 6 different sectors in Freedonia, in 2 years, 1975 and 1995. At a first glance, there were more male workers than the females in general. However, dramatic improvements have taken place for women work scenario after 20 years. In the year 1975, 650,000 manufacturing workers were men, almost treble than the number of women workers. The same scenario can be seen regarding the financial sector, while the smallest difference was in the communications sector as males outnumbered females by 50,000. The figures of defense public sector employees quadrupled those of non-defense. After 2 decades, distributions of workers in manufacturing and non-defense public sector remained similar, while the number of female employees in communication increased more than twofold to become 550,000. Female staffs in the finance/banking sector also soared to around 450,000 but were still nearly 20,000 fewer than male counterparts. As for the defense sector, the number of women rose to just over 100,000 while it stood at exactly 200,000 men. Model answer 16. The line graphs illustrate the number of employed people in different work divisions in 1975 and 1995 in the Republic of Freedonia. At the first glance, over the 20 years period, the number of men remained almost the same in all work sectors but the number of women increased in 4 sectors: communications, finance/banking, wholesale, retail, trade, and defense in the public sector. In 1975, in all 6 sectors, the number of women was fewer than that of men compared to the year 1995, in which the number of women went above the number of men in 2 sectors, communications and wholesale and retail trade. In the communications sector, the number of women almost tripled in 20 years. The other upsurge of the number of female workers was seen in the wholesale and retail trade, where the number climbed from around 500 to 800. We see the acclivity in the number of women employees in finance/banking and defense, public, sectors. The number of women almost tripled in the finance and defense sectors over 2 decades. The number of men in all sectors remained almost the same except in the defense sector where their number marginally increased just above 200. In addition, it is worth mentioning that the number of men remained greater than that of women in the majority of sectors except 2 of them, namely communications and wholesale and retail trade. Model answer 17. The charts illustrate the number of employees, male and female, in 6 sectors of the Republic of Freedonia in 2 different years, 1975 and 1995. Overall, the male workers exceed females with the exception of communication and wholesale and retail trade. Moreover, women progressed much in terms of female employee number in these job sectors. In 1975, the number of male workers was remarkably higher than female workers in all 6 sectors. Particular in manufacturing, more than 600 male employees were employed per 1,000, which was double than the number of female workers. In 1995, female employees showed progress in all sectors. For instance, female workers went ahead in communications with more than 500 employees per 1,000 versus 300 male employees. For wholesale and retail trade, the female rose approximately 800 employees per 1,000 contra 700 employees out of 1,000. Finally, the numbers of male and female workers in other sectors remained somewhat stable with a slight change in the public sector, defense, that recorded for male and female respectively, exactly 200 male employees, 100 female employees, per 1,000. Model answer 18. The graphs compare workforce of men and women in Freedonia in 1975 and 1995 splitting into 6 categories: manufacturing, communities, finance, wholesale, and the public sectors, both non-defense and defense. Overall in 1975, men outnumbered women in all job sectors but in 2 decades, women progressed remarkably well in different jobs in Freedonia. In 1975, men took over nearly 700 jobs out of 1,000 in manufacturing. Meanwhile, there were only 300 women in this field and the number of employees from both genders remained the same in 1995. In the non-defense public sector, there were around 850 men and 650 women in both years. Men domination in job sectors in Freedonia was quite visible in 1975. However, in 1995, there was a rapid growth of female employees in most of the job categories and surprisingly they outnumbered men in communication and sales-related jobs. For instance, 300 men worked in communities in 1975, and this number stayed the same in 1995. But the number of women employees in this sector rocketed up from 250 to nearly double than that of men, 550 in 1995. In finance and defense-related jobs, females progressed quite well. Only around 100 women worked in the finance sector in 1975, but then this number rose 4 times to more than 400 in 1995. Model answer 19. The chart illustrates the distribution of 1,000 male and female taken as samples from across 6 different sectors in Freedonia between 1975 and 1995. Overall, the employment rate for men in both years was proportionately higher than that of women across all sectors barring communications and wholesale and retail trade. In the manufacturing sector, the rate of employment did not see any major fluctuations in the employment rates of men and women in both years. Approximately 300 for men and nearly 500 for women. Finance/banking sector definitely witnessed an upward trend for women employment rate rising from just above 100 in 1975 to close to 500 in 1995, whereas men were almost stagnating at just above 400. The employment rate in public sector, non-defense, remained almost unchanged in both years, with men hovering just near 900 and women steadily holding on to close to 700. Public sector, defense, saw a rise in employment for women where their number rose. Furthermore, communications sector witnessed a paradigm shift in the number of employment for women from 1975 to 1995, where women jumped from approximately 250 to close to 550 respectively. Wholesale and retail trade saw upward movement for women, with their employment rate rising from just above 500